thank you. So on to Brennain Lloyd. Brennain has been working on the nuclear file for, since the mid to late 80s. She started out as a peace activist, got very actively engaged in the whole nuclear waste issue, has been following it since that time. I call her the queen, Canada's queen of anti-nuclear waste. Nobody knows more about the issue than Lorraine, or than Brennain, because she's been at it for so long.
And Lorraine.
Lorraine. Brennain is a community organizer with Northwatch, which is a non-governmental organization based in North Bay, committed to the environment in Northern Ontario, and forestry issues as well, very engaged with. And she's been a critical voice, as I mentioned earlier, on this debate, and we're very lucky to have her. Thank you so much for driving all the way here from North Bay just for this, and she's going back today. So drive safely, all of you.
Thank you, Angela, and thanks to all of you. It's a lovely room to be in, both in terms of the people and the physical space. So, 15 minutes. Nuclear waste. It's a big thing, and we're going to try and cram it in. So I decided we'd do the 10 things you need to know. Maybe inspired by the David Letterman's top 10 list, or whatever he calls it, but I can't quite go at his pace. So 10 things you need to know in 15 minutes or less. So, using nuclear power to generate electricity creates waste. It creates waste from start to finish. It starts with uranium mine tailings. That first image was the tailings in the Elliott Lake Basin in Serpent River First Nations territory, Lorraine's territory, and it ends with irradiated fuel, or the industry likes to call it spent fuel. It's not very spent. 98% of the radioactivity is still in those irradiated fuel bundles when they come out of the reactor. It's just because of the reactor design, they don't have the coefficient, I think it's called, to keep using it in the reactor. But it's still got all that energy in it. And in Canada, we are host to the entire fuel chain, from the uranium mining, which is now in northern Saskatchewan because it's a much higher grade, through to the refining in Blind River, also on the north shore of Lake Huron, to the fuel fabrication in Port Hope, to the reactors in Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, to the fuel waste. So the high-level waste, so we've got all those kinds of waste, and we've got low and intermediate, and high-level waste. What we're going to talk about mostly for the next few minutes is high-level waste, the fuel waste, which is the irradiated fuel. So in other countries, there might be other kinds of waste that are referred to as high-level from the weapons program. In Canada, if we say high-level, we're talking about the fuel waste, even though some of the intermediate waste is as highly radioactive as the fuel waste. But we don't call it that. We call it intermediate. High-level waste is the fuel waste, irradiated fuel waste, and it's about 1 million times more radioactive than the uranium bundle when it goes into the reactor, which is radioactive and chemically toxic, but it's 1 million times more radioactive when it comes out. So when it goes into the reactor, what happens in the reactor? So number 2, that waste, the fuel waste, is so much more radioactive. So what happens is the fuel bundle goes into the reactor. What happens inside the reactor is that uranium atom is split. It's bombarded with neutrons, and it splits, and it splits, and it splits, and it splits, and it splits. And it keeps on splitting. It keeps on generating energy, generating heat. And that heat, that energy, is radioactivity. And so we have uranium that becomes between 250 and 300 different radioactive waste products. And the industry likes to talk about this half-life thing. You know, it's sort of like, if you read the Nuclear Waste Management Organization's materials, they talk about how it decays over time, and, half-life is like a good news story. But in fact, it's a bad news story, because what happens as it goes in that half-life, so half-lives are, for kind of your typical radioactive isotope, plutonium, which is the weapons material. It has a half-life of 24,900 years. So that means it takes 24,900 years for it to reduce its radioactivity by half. But it's not just sitting around waiting for that 24,900 year milestone and zip, it's half. It's giving off energy all the time. It's decaying. And that decay chain means that it goes from uranium to thorium to protactinum to actinum to thorium to frank. I have a commitment to never learn the decay chain of a single one of those 250 to 300 radioactive isotopes. But that's what they do, and as they go, they give off energy. Every time, every step along the decay chain, it gives off energy, and that energy is radiation. That energy is radioactivity. Number 3, even low levels of exposure can harm us. It can harm us, it can harm other living things, even low levels of radioactivity. And it can harm us in different ways. So we're differently vulnerable. So as a woman, I'm more vulnerable than a man, on average. This is on average because generally women have more fatty tissues, so we store all kinds of toxins and harmful things more than men. So we're more vulnerable. But because the damage that happens from exposure to radiation happens at a cellular level, those whose cells are multiplying more rapidly are the most vulnerable. So the child in the womb is the most vulnerable. The young children who are growing rapidly, their cells are reproducing, they're more vulnerable. So we're differently vulnerable. Somebody who already has some kind of stress on their system. Maybe they've got some other autoimmune disease, because what radiation does is it speeds us along that path towards autoimmune diseases. So our immune systems fail. Dr. Rosalie Bertell calls this the species death syndrome. And what she said, and this is many years ago, but it was a really compelling way to describe our situation. She said that as our system is more and more loaded, the system, the natural system, our world, with things that our immune system has to deal with, our immune system is less and less able to deal with it. And so someone whose immune system is already compromised or stressed or strained will be more vulnerable. So it doesn't mean that every exposure to radiation, every radiological event is going to cause you a identifiable, measurable harm. The industry and the regulators like to describe exposure, like to kind of quantify this risk in cancer deaths. So back in the 1990s, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited had a previous proposal than the one we're dealing with now to bury nuclear waste. That was in the Canadian Shield. And their risk assessment was 3 deaths per million. So they said 3 deaths per million. That's what it would. The Darlington, the new build of nuclear reactors for new reactors at Darlington, the risk assessment for infant mortality was 0.17, which I find chilling. All my children have been born in, none of them have been fractional. They've all been whole people. 0.17, it's a very calculated way. It's a very utilitarian way to describe what happens to us or can happen to us as populations as a result of exposure. It doesn't mean that every exposure is going to result in a measurable harm. It means that we're all vulnerable and every exposure contributes to the risk, increases the risk. And it might not be a cancer death. That's what industry and regulators measure in, but it might not be a cancer death. It might be more allergies. It might be increased incidence of asthma. It might be any of those other autoimmune disorders. So there's all kinds of different ways, and it's very difficult to measure, to track, to correspond, partly because the workers aren't tracked. We have a more mobile population than we used to have, and I see my system says I should keep going, catch up with David Letterman. So number 4, the power industry, the nuclear power industry in Canada has already produced a huge amount of waste, a very large quantity of waste. Over 3 million bundles, 50,000 tons of waste, of high-level waste already produced. So it goes in that fuel bundle goes into the reactor. It's in there for only 18 months and it has to come out. When it comes out, it goes into a irradiated fuel bay or a cooling pool or a fuel pool. It's called different things. The industry says that that's in there for 8 to 10 years. But in fact, we did a quick look at the numbers, and the fuel is staying in the pool for much longer before it's moved to the next category of management, which is dry cask storage or dry storage at the reactor site. So there are some real questions about why industry persistently says the fuel is in the pools, the irradiated fuel is in the pools for 6 to 8 years or 8 to 10 years, and yet we're seeing that 2/3 of the waste in Ontario is still in the pool, which means it's staying in those fuel bays for a much longer time. And the lessons of Fukushima is that the fuel is in a very vulnerable state when it's in the pool. And most of the radiological release from Fukushima Daiichi was from the fuel in the pools, not from the reactor core, not to minimize the huge impacts of the reactor failures, but the fuel in the pool is a huge vulnerability. So, number 5, the industry has a plan, still has a plan, has another plan to bury their nuclear waste, to bury the highly radioactive fuel waste that they've created. And they've had this plan in different variations for a long time. They started off in 1977, 3 men for 3 months looked at the problem. After having already been generating the waste for quite a long time, the government said, oh, you better look at this. 3 men, 3 months, said, oh, let's bury it in the Canadian Shield. If that doesn't work out, let's put it in salt. And the industry and the federal government have been committed to that ever since and have spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to prove and reprove this idea of safely burying nuclear waste in a rock somewhere. So they started off with the Hare Report in the late 70s, then in the early 80s, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited did a failed site search. They couldn't find a community even willing to entertain the idea. Then they developed a generic concept. It went to a federal hearing through the 1990s, failed to get assessment, failed to get approval. And then the federal government thanked the panel, that 10-year panel, for their 10 years of work. The panel said, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited has not demonstrated their concept to be safe and acceptable. That was their key question. And they recommended that there be an independent agency, arm's length from government, set up for next stages of the work, and that there be a framework for Aboriginal people's participation developed by Aboriginal people. The federal government said, oh, thanks so much. We accept your recommendations in principle. Dangerous words when you hear them in a response from government to a federal panel that's done a reasonably good job under difficult circumstances. And they created the Nuclear Fuel Waste Act, which then allowed the industry, or directed the industry, to create the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is an association of the waste generators, Ontario Power Generation, Hydro-Quebec, New Brunswick Power, and they came out, voila, with an idea very, very similar to the idea of the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s. In 2005, they recommended what they call adaptive phase management, a little bit different because it includes what they call a management strategy, a very long siting process, and they expanded their scope. So it's no longer restricted to the Canadian Shield. Any rock will do, including the sedimentary rocks of southern Ontario. So after 30 years, the industry around the world and in Canada has not been successful in burying nuclear waste, nuclear fuel waste, anywhere. And there have been many countries who have had a program similar to Canada's, in that they've looked to develop a design, a concept, or whatever, find a site and proceed. Not a single country has done it. And there's a number of reasons for that. In many instances, the communities have rejected the very notion. Technically, there are a large number of uncertainties related to this idea. So the idea of burying nuclear waste in the rock, deep below the surface, there are many technical and scientific uncertainties which are unresolved. The industry doesn't acknowledge that in Canada. but internationally it's well documented. There's a much healthier debate, I would say, in Europe, where it's not all the dollars, not all the research dollars are controlled by industry as they are here. So there's a number of issues around the containers, the rate of corrosion, the backfill, the effectiveness of the rock as a barrier, and what happens when you combine all those ingredients of radioactivity, of heat, of corrosion of metal. Those things combine, they are gases that are generated and combine with that heat and the other chemical phenomena, and they create outward pressures. So you have a rock which might have been, before it was intruded upon, before it had, massive shafts and tunnels and caverns dug out of it, it might have seemed like it was a fairly homogeneous rock, piece of rock. Might have seemed fairly tight, might have seemed like things might not move, water might not move through it too quickly, but once you then put these, shafts and tunnels and caverns, you've changed that rock. An undisturbed site and a disturbed site, a rock that is in its natural state and a rock that has been, cut into are very different. So then you add in all that soup of heat, gas generation, corrosion, and you increase those outward pressures and increase the opportunity and the speed for those radionuclides to move out to the surface through gas, through water, through microbes carrying them out. And so there's a whole bunch of technical issues, and there's a couple of very good summaries of that we have links to on one of our websites. But one of, I think, the most helpful was one done by the United Kingdom Environmental Agency. And they, unlike in Canada, if you go to a hearing about a nuclear matter in Canada, Environment Canada will say, oh, well, we don't really have the capacity. We don't really have the expertise. We have to rely on the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. In other countries, there are independent experts or separate agencies within government who can provide some oversight. And in the UK, the Environmental Agency does have capacity. And what they said is, yes, there are all these uncertainties, and yes, more work that needs to be done, but, and this was very important, they said, after you do that additional work, that work may or may not indicate that an acceptable safety case can be made. The safety case is a set of technical arguments that says we're good to go. And they said, yeah, do more work, sure, but be prepared for continued uncertainty after that. And I would say from the hearing on ACL's concept in the 1990s to where we're at now, the same issues are there. They've just become more detailed. Nothing has been resolved. So there's no geologic repository, no deep repository operating anywhere in the world. We just went through a lengthy hearing on a proposal we're not talking about today, unless you want to in question and answers, to bury low and so-called intermediate level waste beneath the Bruce Nuclear Generating Station. And Ontario Power Generation, trotted out the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico as the great example. Well, WIPP has failed. There have been, a series of incidents, including underground fire, unanticipated release of radioactivity to the surface. It's closed down. They haven't even completed the accident investigation report almost a year later. There's no successful example anywhere in the world for any waste, and certainly not for high-level waste. So, transporting the waste increases the risk. The more every instance of transfer, every instance of transportation increases the risk. And those are risks that we are all going to share, everyone along the route from a reactor station to any community who might, for whatever reason, end up being put on the receiving end of all of Canada's fuel waste. Industry is now ramping up. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization is now, last year they began, this year even more so, ramping up their work on transportation. And we really need some more technical work to apply, with respect to the can-do fuel and its transportation. All the international work is using other fuel types, so it's hard to really come up with a good analysis of what industry is putting forward. But what we do know, and what we can, really extrapolate from those other studies, is that there will be both risk of routine exposure and catastrophic exposure from accidents. So even if everything goes well, there's still going to be exposures, low levels, but as we know, even low levels of exposure are harmful. So right now, the industry is investigating 11 communities as possible burial sites. So 2 years ago, they had 21 communities that they were studying, and now they're down to 11 communities. Most of them in Northern Ontario, a couple in the shadow of Bruce Nuclear, one of them in Northern Saskatchewan. I'm most familiar with the ones in Northern Ontario. They're all communities who have, are struggling economically and have, most of them have lost a major industry within the last few years. And it's really this price tag the industry keeps putting out, $16 to $24 billion national infrastructure project. They don't call it a nuclear waste burial scheme. It's a national infrastructure project. Over the last year, we've seen what's called a withdrawal of land. So in mining world, this means that the land's no longer available for mineral staking, exploration, and development. And those land withdrawals are a flag as to where industry is really concentrating their investigation. And so there are 20-some sites in Northern Ontario, and on average there, of the 7 communities, it's about 6,000 hectares each. So it's a very large area have been withdrawn. So First Nations across Northern Ontario are opposed. Every treaty area, Robinson Huron chiefs, they are opposed. They do not support the NWMO even investigating their territories for this project. So, what to do? The best thing we can do, we have a perpetual problem. It is a problem. It is a challenge which has been created for all generations to come by the generations past. That's just the reality. So there's no good news story there. But what do? Well, we go with the best we can, and the best we can is to make the waste more secure at its current location. Not status quo, not leaving it in the pools, not Staples-style warehouse buildings to put the dry cask storage, making it more secure. We need to move from this old think of burying a bone to developing, and Canada needs to join a very active international discussion about extended on-site storage. In the US, there's a model called hardened on-site storage, and that's where we need to go. Stop wasting communities' time, stop wasting taxpayers' and ratepayers' dollars, get real, and make the waste more secure, and shut it down. Stop creating more.